Hello, and welcome to The Sleepy Why, a channel where we try to fall asleep a little wiser than we woke. Tonight, we're sinking into a question so soft it's almost a whisper. Why does silence feel so loud? Maybe you've noticed it before. In the middle of the night, when the world forgets to hum, or in a deep forest after the birds have flown, or inside a quiet room where your own heartbeat becomes the only sound left. There's a strange tension in those moments, as if the stillness is pressing against the inside of your ears, asking to be noticed. But what exactly are we hearing when there's nothing to hear? In this episode, we'll explore the science of silence and the sound of the brain, wander through echo-free chambers and ancient monasteries, and peer into the acoustic properties of space itself. We'll meet composers who used silence as their most powerful instrument, and scientists who discovered that even the vacuum of space is never truly silent. So, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the vast, invisible symphony of nothing. Understood. In 2011, a research facility in Minneapolis began attracting visitors for a strange and specific reason. They wanted to experience the quietest place on Earth. The Orfield Lab's anechoic chamber had been engineered to its walls were lined with thick wedges of fiberglass foam, each angled precisely to prevent sound waves from reflecting. Inside, there was no echo, no ambient noise, no perceptual feedback at all. Within seconds of entering the room, most visitors reported an eerie physical sensation, not peace, but pressure. They weren't just surrounded by silence, they were inside it. What startled people most wasn't the absence of noise, but the sudden emergence of internal sound. Visitors described hearing the dull rhythm of blood in their veins, the low-frequency hum of their own nervous system, the faint crackle of joints and cartilage shifting with every movement. In ordinary environments, such signals are masked by layers of background input, the whir of machines, the distant drone of traffic, the soft chatter of modern life. But in the chamber, those external cues vanish, and the auditory system, deprived of stimulation, turns inward. The result is not a passive quiet, but a hyperactive form of internal listening. The silence is filled by the body itself. This phenomenon reflects a larger truth about how human perception evolved. Unlike most other senses, hearing is always on. The eyes can close, the tongue can rest. But the ears, lacking any protective shutter, remain open around the clock. For early humans, this perpetual vigilance served a clear purpose: to detect threats in the environment, especially during the night. The rustle of grass might signal prey. The sudden stillness of birds might mean a predator. In this evolutionary context, silence was not calming. It was suspicious. The world had gone quiet, and that quiet might mean danger. Our brains adapted accordingly, developing a neurological bias for filling in gaps when expected signals go missing. What researchers have observed in the anechoic chamber is a modern echo of this ancient logic. When external sound disappears, the brain compensates. The auditory cortex does not shut down, it increases sensitivity. Neurons begin to fire in anticipation, generating spontaneous activity that can sometimes be experienced as phantom sounds. This is part of why some people, when exposed to prolonged silence, report hearing voices, music, or persistent ringing. The phenomenon, known as auditory filling in, is structurally similar to how the brain fills in visual blind spots, not with nothing, but with the best guess. But the chamber reveals something more than just a curious trick of perception. It exposes a deeper relationship between silence and the systems we use to make sense of the world. For most of history, sound has been a tool for spatial orientation. We use it to gauge distance, movement, proximity. In everyday life, sound reflects off walls and surfaces, giving us a sense of the size and layout of our surroundings. In the anechoic chamber, that feedback disappears. People often report a loss of bodily awareness, a sense of floating, or even dizziness, not because the room spins, but because the internal map of the body no longer aligns with external reference points. In the absence of reflected sound, space itself becomes difficult to locate. This helps explain why silence, particularly the engineered silence of places like Orfield Labs, can feel disorienting rather than soothing. It interrupts not just hearing, but the brain's model of the world. We are, in effect, left with an incomplete simulation. The body is present, but unanchored. The environment offers no cues. Time seems to stretch. Thought loops become louder. The self, unmoored from its surroundings, begins to amplify. Silence, in this context, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a different kind of information, one that foregrounds the mechanisms of perception themselves. What the chamber reveals in its extreme stillness is not quietude, but the machinery behind attention. We become aware of the scaffolding, the low hum of biological function, the subconscious filtering of sensory input, the constant effort the brain exerts to interpret and predict. This is not just an auditory effect. In architecture, sound plays a critical role in how people experience built environments. Churches, concert halls, libraries, all are shaped by acoustics. The absence or manipulation of sound alters behavior. A room like Orfield's is designed to eliminate feedback entirely, but even partial reductions in ambient sound can influence emotion and cognition. Hospitals that minimize noise levels, open-plan offices that introduce sound masking, see higher productivity. In both cases, silence, or something close to it, becomes a functional design variable, not an aesthetic one. What makes the anechoic chamber remarkable is that it isolates a principle that usually operates in the background, that silence is never just empty. It is shaped by context, perception, and history. When we walk into a library and lower our voice, we are not reacting to physical silence, but to a cultural expectation that quiet means contemplation. When we feel unsettled in a paused conversation, it is not the lack of speech that disturbs us, but what the silence might imply. The chamber simply removes all ambiguity. It lets silence operate without metaphor or meaning. And in doing so, it reveals a fact that ripples outward into neuroscience, architecture, and even music, that silence is not passive. It is participatory. It invites or demands a response. To understand how we got here and why silence produces such strong reactions in the brain, we have to step outside the lab, not forward, but back, to the forests and open plains where the auditory system evolved. Because long before humans began to seek out quiet spaces, we learned to survive in noisy ones. And that noise, it turns out, taught us how to listen. Long before we engineered silence, we evolved in a world that never offered it. For early humans on the African savanna, sound was an essential tool for survival. Unlike vision, which is limited by direction and distance, hearing is omnidirectional. It warns of what's behind you, above you, moving through brush in the dark. Evolution favored auditory sensitivity because it extended awareness beyond the visual field. A rustle in tall grass could mean a rabbit, or a lion. Either way, the timing mattered. What made this sensory system so powerful wasn't just the ability to detect sound, but the ability to interpret its absence. When birds go quiet, it signals disruption. When wind stops, tension rises. Silence, in nature, is rarely sustained. It's a gap in the usual signal stream, a blank space that demands explanation. Our ancestors learned to treat those gaps not as relief, but as warning. This is the paradox modern humans have inherited. We romanticize silence, imagining it as a kind of sensory blank slate, ideal for focus or introspection. But for much of our evolutionary history, quiet moments were a prelude to threat. That tension is still encoded in the way our nervous systems respond. Sudden silence in a crowded room triggers alertness. A lull in conversation prompts discomfort. We are, in some fundamental way, not built for stillness. This evolutionary backdrop helps explain why artificially silent environments, like the anechoic chamber, produce They remove the constant low-level stimuli our brains use to map the world. In evolutionary terms, these inputs were never just background noise. They were vital data streams. The rustling of leaves, the buzz of insects, the chatter of birds, each was part of an ecological symphony that helped us interpret motion, weather, time of day, and proximity of life. When that symphony is stripped away, the brain loses calibration. It begins to amplify internal signals. Tinnitus, for instance, often emerges or worsens in quiet spaces, not because silence causes it, but because there is no competing input to mask it. The phenomenon reflects a deeper tendency of the brain to fill in missing data. Just as the visual system compensates for the blind spot in each eye, the auditory system guesses when the signal disappears. Anthropologists have long noted that no human culture evolved in silence. Every known society has developed sound-based rituals: drumming, singing, storytelling, chanting. These weren't just expressive tools, they were ways of organizing collective attention. In many traditional societies, sound was woven into the landscape itself. Aboriginal songlines, for example, encoded geography into melody, allowing navigation through vast territories via remembered tune. In these contexts, silence was not neutral. It represented disconnection, the absence of information. Even in the history of writing, sound played a foundational role. Ancient scripts were often read aloud, even when alone. Silent reading, in fact, was considered unusual in the classical world. Augustine of Hippo once marveled that Ambrose, a 4th-century bishop, could read without moving his lips. The association between knowledge and voice was so strong that the absence of sound seemed almost unnatural. This brings us to an important shift: the industrial age, when the ambient noise of machines became the backdrop to everyday life. For the first time, humans began actively seeking out silence, not as a threat, but as a remedy. Quiet carriages on trains, no talking rules in libraries, urban noise ordinances, all emerged in response to the new acoustic density of the modern world. Silence, once a cue for caution, became a scarce and desirable resource. Yet the brain never quite unlearned its early training. That's why silence remains unstable, difficult to hold for long periods. When the noise drops out, attention turns inward. And when the world stops providing information, the brain begins generating its own. This duality, silence as relief, silence as alert, runs through every system we've built around it. It's why meditation practices emphasize the challenge of stillness. It's why composers use silence not as emptiness, but as structure. It's why the absence of sound is often more meaningful than sound itself. The pursuit of silence did not begin with science. It began with space. Long before acoustic engineers learned to absorb sound waves, architects were shaping silence with stone. In medieval Europe, monasteries and cathedrals were designed not only for worship but for listening, and equally for what was not heard. Thick walls, vaulted ceilings, and narrow cloisters muffled the outside world. Monks observed hours of silence, not just as spiritual practice, but as a form of environmental design. The architecture reinforced the vow. The silence reinforced the architecture. What made these spaces powerful was not their absolute quiet. Few were ever truly silent, but their control over sound. The echo inside a Gothic nave was not accidental. It produced a kind of sonic awe, stretching each syllable of chant into a slow decay. Speech slowed down. Breathing changed. Time expanded. The building taught its visitor. Modern acoustic science would later describe this phenomenon in terms of reverberation time and surface absorption. But centuries earlier, builders understood it intuitively. Certain materials, thick stone, plaster, wood, absorbed or reflected sound in specific ways. Placement of columns, the height of ceilings, the shape of domes, all affected the quality of silence inside. These were spaces where silence wasn't just present, it was constructed. This principle carried forward into secular buildings. Libraries, in particular, became engineered environments for quiet attention. The New York Public Library, completed in 1911, was designed not just to store books, but to manage acoustics. Marble walls and high ceilings created zones of soft hush, while thick carpets and wooden desks dampened footfall and page turns. The reading room became a chamber not of silence, but of low-intensity sound, a curated stillness where concentration could flourish. What these spaces understood, long before psychology caught up, is that silence functions differently depending on context. A sudden drop in volume on a busy street triggers alarm. The same drop in a reading room triggers focus. In both cases, the ears are doing the same thing. The difference lies in expectation. Silence, like sound, is shaped by design. The rise of modernist architecture in the 20th century brought a new approach. With the development of steel and glass construction, buildings became larger, more open, and less forgiving. Hard surfaces reflected sound. Open-plan offices introduced a constant churn of footsteps, typing, and conversation. At the same time, new technologies made artificial silence possible. Noise-canceling materials, soundproof windows, acoustic panels. The ability to control sound became an invisible layer of design, sometimes ignored, sometimes engineered with extreme precision. One of the clearest examples came not from libraries or churches, but from outer space. When NASA began training astronauts for extended missions, engineers realized they needed to simulate the acoustic conditions of spacecraft, not just the machinery, but the absence of natural sound. In orbit, there is no wind, no birds, no echo. To mimic this, NASA constructed acoustic chambers with ultra-low noise floors. Astronauts train their minds not only to operate under pressure, but to tolerate sensory monotony. It turns out, silence, in prolonged doses, can be as psychologically demanding as chaos. The same insight has begun to influence contemporary design. Hospitals have rethought their soundscapes, realizing that ambient noise affects recovery. Museums now use subtle sound zoning to guide movement and attention. High-end cars introduce artificial engine noise to avoid total acoustic isolation. Even smartphone interfaces include haptic feedback, tiny clicks and buzzes, to replace the sensory data that digital interaction removes. In each case, silence is not treated as a void, but as a designed experience. We no longer assume that removing sound is inherently good. Instead, we ask, what kind of silence does this space produce? What does it allow the mind to do? How long can it be sustained before it tips into discomfort? These questions reveal the deeper complexity of silence as a perceptual tool. It is not binary. It exists on a spectrum, from calming to eerie, from clarifying to disorienting. And like light, it is shaped by reflection, surface, and distance. This makes silence a kind of medium, not unlike air or glass, something we move through, something that bends and filters the information we take in. And as with any medium, its effects depend on context, on design, and on the expectations we bring with us. One of the most revealing findings in modern neuroscience is that perception is not primarily reactive, it is predictive. The brain does not passively absorb the world, it constructs models of it, and then updates those models when reality deviates. In this framework, silence is not simply the absence of sound, it is the violation of an expectation. And when the signal goes missing, the brain begins to fill in the gaps. This predictive architecture is especially active in the auditory system. The brain constantly forecasts what it expects to hear based on context, prior experience, and rhythmic patterns. That's why we can follow a melody through missing notes, or understand a sentence through heavy static. Even when actual input is degraded or absent, the brain provides its best guess. This is not a design flaw, it's a strategy. But in environments of extreme quiet, like the anechoic chamber, or deep wilderness, or space, the strategy begins to misfire. In these settings, the auditory system, starved for input, increases its gain, a technical term for sensitivity. It's the same principle used in amplifiers. When the incoming signal is weak, you turn up the volume. But when there's nothing to amplify, you begin to pick up internal noise. Neurons fire spontaneously. The cochlea vibrates with minute energy. Some people hear high-pitched tones, others detect imagined music or vague whispering. These are not delusions, they are the byproducts of a healthy brain operating with insufficient data. One of the clearest examples of this phenomenon is tinnitus, the perception of ringing or buzzing in the absence of external sound. In many cases, tinnitus is triggered or worsened by silence. People notice it most when lying in bed, or walking through a quiet forest, or sitting alone in a soundproof room. What begins as a faint hum can grow into a persistent presence, sometimes debilitating. Researchers now believe that in many forms of tinnitus, the problem lies not in the ear, but in the brain. The auditory cortex, deprived of normal stimuli, begins generating its own. The silence doesn't just reveal the symptom, it causes it. This same principle appears across other sensory domains. In vision, for instance, the brain fills in the blind spot created by the optic nerve. In touch, phantom limb syndrome causes amputees to feel sensations in limbs that no longer exist. In hearing, the analog is clear. The brain does not wait for sound, it anticipates it. And when sound does not arrive, it substitutes. What makes this insight more than a medical curiosity is its implication for how we understand the mind's relationship to the world. If perception is fundamentally model-driven, then silence is not simply what we fail to hear. It is what the model cannot explain. The discomfort that often accompanies prolonged quiet is not a failure of attention. It's a mismatch between expectation and input. This helps explain why certain silences feel heavier than others. The awkward pause in conversation, the sudden dropout on a phone call, the moment after a punchline fails to land. In each case, the brain has modeled a different outcome, a continuation, a reaction, a closure. And when that outcome doesn't materialize, the silence becomes charged. It is not the lack of sound that disturbs us. It is the failure of the pattern. Composers have long exploited this principle. In the 20th century, artists like John Cage began treating silence as an active musical element. Cage's most famous piece, Force 33 Sty, consists entirely of silence, or more precisely, of the ambient sounds that arise when a performer does nothing. The piece forces listeners to confront the sounds they usually ignore: the cough in the third row, the distant traffic, the ticking of the clock. But it also exploits the predictive system of the mind. We expect music. We wait. The silence becomes attention. The brain, unwilling to sit still, begins composing on its own. In a very different setting, meditation traditions have described similar effects for centuries. In prolonged stillness, attention turns inward. Thoughts grow louder. Subtle sounds become prominent. Some describe hearing their heartbeat in their head. Others report tones, pulses. These are not imagined. They are internally generated responses to a system temporarily cut off from external feedback. Neuroscientific studies have begun to map this process in detail. Functional MRI scans show increased activity in the auditory cortex during periods of silence. This is counterintuitive. We would expect a silent environment to produce neural quiet. But in fact, the opposite often occurs. The brain responds to the absence of sound by simulating its presence. This phenomenon, silence, induced simulation, is now being studied. Not only the recurring pattern is clear: when expected input disappears, the brain becomes generative. It invents. And sometimes the inventions feel real. This is not a failure of perception. It is the architecture of it. The most vivid internal simulations we experience don't happen in sensory deprivation tanks or anechoic chambers. They happen every night during REM sleep, when the brain constructs not just phantom sounds or images, but entire environments, complete with characters, spatial logic, emotional tone, and unfolding events. Unlike waking silence, which exposes the scaffolding of perception, dreaming removes the scaffolding entirely and lets the simulation take over. REM sleep is characterized by heightened neural activity in the absence of external input. The eyes move rapidly, the body remains paralyzed. The brain, meanwhile, behaves as if it is awake. Cortical regions responsible for vision, language, and emotion light up in complex, coordinated patterns. People hear music that doesn't exist. They speak in languages they don't know. They hear voices, footsteps, laughter, all created without a single vibration reaching the ear. The same predictive mechanisms that generate phantom sounds in silence are now operating in a different mode, full immersion. But the origin is the same. The brain, lacking real input, begins to fabricate. In silence, the simulations are modest. Tones, murmurs, maybe a whisper. In sleep, they scale up. The model doesn't just fill in gaps, it constructs whole realities. This capacity to simulate has long fascinated researchers, not because it reveals abnormal brain function, but because it reveals how the normal brain works. Dreaming is not an exception to waking life. It is an intensified version of the same processes. Prediction, interpretation, narrative, all run in a closed loop. What changes is the balance of input and invention. In dreams, invention wins. Studies of sensory deprivation have shown a similar pattern. When people are placed in environments with minimal auditory and visual stimuli, even without sleep, they begin to experience dream-like effects, visual hallucinations, auditory illusions, disruptions in time perception. The threshold for simulation drops. The brain begins to fabricate earlier and with less provocation. This is part of what makes silence so cognitively unstable. It opens the door to a mode of perception that is always running beneath the surface. The mind, stripped of input, reveals its generative nature. It doesn't go quiet. It produces. The longer the silence holds, the more elaborate the production becomes. But dreams are not just private phenomena. They have had profound effects on culture, science, and belief systems throughout history. Many of the earliest myths, from Mesopotamian epics to the rituals of indigenous tribes, treat dreams as revelations. Ancient Egyptians wrote manuals for interpreting dreams. Greek philosophers argued about whether they came from gods or digestion. The silence of sleep, like the silence of space or stone, became a surface onto which meaning could be projected. In modern science, dreaming has become a window into the mechanics of prediction. Researchers have begun to see it not as a passive state, but as a kind of training ground. During REM sleep, the brain may rehearse scenarios, reprocess memories, and test variations of reality, all without consequence. It is simulation at full volume, protected by paralysis and bounded by sleep. This connects directly to what happens in silence. In both cases, the brain loses access to reliable external feedback. And in both, it responds not with inactivity, but with invention. The same structures that fill in a missing voice on the phone call, or generate a phantom ring in a quiet room, are capable of constructing entire dreamscapes when fully untethered. Silence is not a lack, it's a launchpad. Understanding this changes how we think about quiet spaces, both literal and metaphorical. They are not just zones of absence, they are zones of generation. The creative process, long associated with silence, is not about the absence of distraction alone. It's about activating this internal simulation network, letting the brain model what isn't there. This may be why so many cultures across time and geography have treated silence as a sacred space, not because it is empty, but because it allows access to something else, something that speaks when the world goes quiet. The silence of dreams may be involuntary, but across centuries, humans have tried to recreate something like it while awake. These attempts were rarely framed in psychological terms. They were spiritual disciplines, cultural rituals, architectural strategies. Yet all were predicated on a common intuition that in the absence of noise, something essential would reveal itself. In the 6th century, Benedict of Nursia drafted a set of rules that would become the foundation for Western monastic life. Among the guidelines for prayer, labor, and humility was a prescription for controlled silence. Monks were to avoid idle chatter, limit speech during meals, and observe quiet hours throughout the day. Silence wasn't total, but structured, a framework for focus, reverence, and introspection. Benedictine silence was not the absence of words, but the elimination of unnecessary ones. The logic was both moral and practical. Speech was a vector for vanity, conflict, and distraction. By reducing it, the monk could reduce the turbulence of mind and spirit. But silence was also a tool for listening, to scripture, to one's conscience, to God. In this sense, it functioned as a perceptual amplifier, not a blank. The less sound came from the outside, the more the monk could hear what came from within. Centuries later, a different form of structured silence emerged in the East. In Buddhist traditions, particularly Zen, silence became a method for disengaging from the self altogether. Rather than listening for internal truths, the practitioner aimed to dissolve the distinction between self and world. The silence of the Zendo was not reverent or obedient, it was attentional. By stilling the external noise, one could observe the mind's tendency to generate internal noise, thoughts, labels, narratives. Meditation aimed to quiet these too, not through suppression, but through non-engagement. Let the thought come. Let it go. Do not follow. The contrast is revealing. In Western monastic silence, the goal was often to hear more clearly. In Zen silence, it was to stop listening entirely. But both traditions recognized what the brain sciences now confirm. Silence changes the configuration of attention. It alters the input-output balance. And in doing so, it shifts the texture of consciousness. This cultural architecture of silence expanded beyond religion. In the 19th century, Henry David Thoreau retreated to Walden Pond to live deliberately in quiet isolation. The Romantics before him had valorized solitude as a path to authenticity. But this new embrace of silence was no longer strictly spiritual. It became psychological. Industrial noise, crowded cities, and the din of modern life all seemed to corrode the self. Silence, like nature, became a restorative opposite. This shift marked the beginning of a secular ethic of quiet, one that persists today. We install noise canceling. We escape to weekend cabins. We design meditation apps with synthetic ocean sounds. The monastic cell has become the Airbnb. The ritual has become self-care. But the benefits of silence are not universal. For some, stillness triggers anxiety. For others, it invites ruminative thought. The same silence that deepens insight for one person may amplify despair for another. In recent studies, psychologists have found that when people are left alone in a room with nothing to do, not even a phone, a significant number, choose to administer themselves mild electric shocks, the mind's restlessness, left unmediated, becomes aversive. In this light, silence is not a blank canvas, it's a stress test. These conflicting effects suggest that silence is not an experience in itself, but a catalyst. It reveals whatever is already stirring beneath the surface: thought loops, unresolved emotion, spiritual insight, boredom. The context matters, the framing matters, and the expectation matters most. A person entering a Zen retreat may interpret a racing mind as part of the process. The same experience in a hospital waiting room may feel unbearable. The silence is the same. This flexibility makes silence a powerful design element, not just in spiritual life, but in psychology, urban planning, and education. It can be manipulated, extended, ritualized, but it cannot be neutralized. It always interacts. In 1952, at a small concert hall in Woodstock, New York, pianist David Tudor walked onto the stage, sat at a grand piano, and opened the score for a new work by avant-garde composer John Cage. The piece was called 4-30-30. Tudor opened the lid of the piano, rested his hands just above the keys, and did nothing. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he didn't play a single note. At the end of each of the 3 movements, he closed and reopened the lid. When the piece was finished, he stood up, bowed, and left the stage. The audience reaction was split. Some confused, some angered, some intrigued. But the provocation was deliberate. Cage wasn't offering silence. He was offering structure without sound. The piece, in his view, was not about absence. It was about attention. During those 4.5 minutes, the room was not empty. Listeners could hear the rustling of programs, the creak of chairs, the ambient hum of air conditioning, even their own breath. The frame of the performance, the presence of a stage, a score, a performer, transformed those everyday sounds into something else, a composition assembled by the environment. What Cage exposed, and what many composers before him had intuited, was that silence is not a void within music. It is its most malleable material. In Western classical tradition, silence is formalized through rests, pauses, fermatas. These are not gaps between events. They are events themselves. A rest at the end of a phrase shapes the way the next note lands. A pause before a resolution builds anticipation. The absence of sound becomes the architecture of emotion. This principle extends beyond composition. In performance, silence controls rhythm and perception. Jazz musicians speak of playing the space, allowing silence to breathe between notes. In Indian classical music, the alap introduces a raga slowly, often with long, unaccompanied stretches of near stillness. In minimalist electronic music, long gaps between beats build a hypnotic tension. In each case, silence is not dead air. It is resonance waiting to happen. Recording engineers and producers have long exploited this effect in the early days of analog tape. Silence was often a technical challenge. The background hiss of tape could never be fully eliminated. But as digital technology emerged in the 1980s and 90s, producers gained precise control over dynamic range. The absence of noise became a tool. A perfectly quiet moment before a drop in a dance track or a sudden pause before a chorus could jolt listeners' attention more effectively than any crescendo. The tension was built not through volume, but through interruption. Even outside music, this logic applies. In film, silence is often more effective than score. A sudden quiet in a horror movie signals danger more powerfully than any sting of violins. In political speechwriting, a well-placed pause can amplify a line's impact. In stand-up comedy, silence after a punchline gives space for laughter, and after a failure, it becomes the punchline. What ties these diverse examples together is not their medium, but their structure. Silence functions as a kind of negative space, not unlike a shadow in a painting or a breath in a sentence. It organizes perception by what it omits, and because it lacks content, it invites into the audience must complete the thought. This interpretive quality makes silence unusually powerful. In music theory, a rest is specific, an eighth-note pause, a half-bar break. But in practice, it is elastic. It stretches and contracts depending on the context, the performer, the listener. It is at once precise and ambiguous, and that ambiguous is where emotion enters. Cage's 4-33 may have formalized this idea, but it was already implicit in centuries of practice. Beethoven used silence to stagger rhythm and break predictability. Mozart, in his Requiem, Miles Davis once said that the most important part of his solos was the space between the notes. In each case, silence was the lever that moved feeling. What these artists understood is now being confirmed in research labs. Studies in auditory neuroscience have shown that the brain responds differently to notes preceded by silence than to notes embedded in sound. The same frequency, played in isolation, activates auditory pathways more intensely. In effect, silence primes perception. It heightens contrast. It makes the expected less predictable. This has implications not only for music, but for how we understand attention more broadly. In a world saturated with noise, auditory, visual, informational, silence becomes a kind of cognitive reset. It punctuates experience. It introduces boundaries. And in doing so, it helps us remember. In 2010, a group of neuroscientists studying auditory processing made an unexpected discovery. While examining how the brain responds to sequences of tones, they introduced short gaps of silence between them to serve as a control, neutral intervals with no stimulus. But the brain didn't treat these silences as neutral. Instead, the auditory cortex fired in patterns just as distinct and measurable as it did when actual sounds were played. The silence, it turned out, was being encoded. This finding added a new dimension to the growing body of research on how the brain structures time. Memory, as psychologists have long understood, is not a perfect record of events, but a reconstruction shaped by attention, emotion, and context. But it is also shaped by rhythm. Just as music relies on rests to create structure, memory relies on pauses to create chapters. The silence between events is what makes them events. We experience this intuitively. When recounting a dramatic story, an accident, an argument, a confession, we often remember not just what was said, but what wasn't. The moment of stillness before the glass shattered, the breath someone took before, the hesitation that changed the outcome. These pauses aren't incidental. They're the framework. Without them, the story becomes a blur. This effect is not limited to speech. In spatial memory, too, silence shapes the narrative. In one experiment, participants were asked to navigate a virtual environment while being exposed to a series of soundscapes. Some environments included intermittent silence, others had a constant background drone. Later, when asked to recall specific features or locations, the group exposed to silence performed significantly better. The pauses acted as cognitive markers, boundaries. They helped the brain decide where one thing ended and another began. In this way, silence functions as a temporal punctuation mark. Just as a period or comma helps organize a sentence, a pause organizes attention. It slows the stream of input, allowing time for consolidation. In conditions of continuous noise, auditory or informational, this consolidation becomes more difficult. The brain doesn't know where to rest. Modern life, of course, excels at eliminating these resting points. Music plays in lobbies, podcasts accompany workouts, notifications punctuate thought. Even in sleep, ambient noise machines are used to mask the unpredictability of natural silence. This constant stream of input may feel efficient or comforting, but it comes at a cognitive cost. Without silence, experience becomes harder to segment, and without segmentation, memory becomes harder to access. The relationship between silence and memory has also been observed in trauma research. Survivors of acute stress often describe time as disjointed, events unfolding in fragments or stretched into slow motion. One theory holds that in moments of extreme threat, the brain's predictive systems become overwhelmed. Input becomes the usual rhythm of attention. The natural ebb and flow that includes pauses breaks down. What remains is a kind of unstructured noise. Restoring rhythm in this framework becomes therapeutic. Practices like mindfulness meditation often emphasize the role of silence, not just in calming the mind, but in creating spaciousness around thought. That spaciousness allows for sequencing, and sequencing is the foundation of memory. To remember something is to place it in order. Silence is what opens the space for order to emerge. This function of silence extends. Audio engineers, when designing alert systems, from hospital monitors to car dashboards, strategically use silence between signals to make them more intelligible. The beep is not the message, the pattern is. And without silence, there is no pattern. Likewise, user interface designers have begun to incorporate cognitive pauses. intentional gaps between actions, transitions, or visual elements that allow users to register what has changed. In both cases, silence is not decorative, it is informational. These insights suggest that silence plays a role far beyond aesthetic or emotion. It is integral to how the brain processes sequences, builds models of time, and encodes experience into memory. We tend to think of silence as something to escape from or seek out, a backdrop for relaxation or contemplation. But its most fundamental function may be structural. It tells us where we are in the story. In space, silence is not a condition, it is a law. There is no medium to carry sound in the vacuum beyond Earth's atmosphere. No wind, no air pressure, no vibrational echo. Astronauts orbiting above the planet do not hear the roar of rockets or the hum of propulsion systems. From the outside, even the most violent explosion would unfold in perfect stillness. For a species whose sensory systems evolved in a world saturated with ambient sound, birdsong, water, insects, the murmur of other humans. This presents a profound challenge. Inside a spacecraft, of course, there is sound. The hum of electronics, the steady rhythm of life, support systems, the occasional mechanical click. But these sounds are artificial, predictable, repetitive, and mostly closed loop. More importantly, they exist within an environment where silence dominates everything outside. Beyond the walls, there is no echo, no up or down, no external reference at all. For many astronauts, the absence of environmental noise is among the most disorienting aspects of orbit. This is not a new insight. As early as the 1960s, NASA psychologists began studying how silence in space affected cognition and mood. What they found was that the lack of sonic feedback disrupted basic orientation. On Earth, we unconsciously use auditory cues to stabilize our sense of motion and environment. A shift in wind, the sound of footsteps on a surface, the resonance of our own voice in a room, all help establish a sense of place. In orbit, those cues vanish. The effects are subtle but cumulative. Astronauts report altered time perception, changes in sleep patterns, and even auditory hallucinations. In long-duration missions, where crews are isolated for weeks or months, the brain begins to compensate, not unlike in anechoic chambers or deep meditation. Tones, rhythms, and phantom voices emerge. The silence does not stay silent. It becomes inhabited. To prepare for this, space agencies began constructing training facilities that simulate not only the visual conditions of orbit, but also its acoustic environment. Soundproof chambers, deprivation tanks, and mock habitats are used to accustom astronauts to the psychological strain of sonic stillness. Some of the most rigorous preparation involves learning how to think clearly in an environment where the world no longer responds. Say something aloud in the spacewalk suit, and you hear your own voice through bone conduction. But no one outside hears anything at all. This condition has a curious effect on language. Without ambient sound, verbal communication becomes either redundant or essential. In spacewalks, radio chatter must be continuous, not for safety alone, but to maintain temporal grounding. Each voice is a tether to human presence. A brief pause in communication can trigger a sense of isolation more intense than silence on Earth. The auditory system, primed for feedback, finds none. This absolute silence, paradoxically, enhances the salience of internal sound. Astronauts report a heightened awareness of their own breath, heartbeat, and even muscle tension. Some describe the experience as meditative, but all agree it is not neutral. The body becomes the only instrument left playing. Interestingly, the silence of space has inspired more than just psychological adaptation. It has shaped the aesthetics of science fiction. In early depictions, filmmakers often ignored the vacuum. Space battles played out with booming soundtracks and rumbling engines. But as public understanding of space physics grew, directors began using silence as a dramatic device. In Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, the sound of explosions is removed entirely during scenes outside the ship. The silence makes the violence more unsettling. it distills it. This technique reveals a deeper truth, that silence, when accurate, can feel more alien than fantasy. The soundlessness of space is not just a scientific fact, it's a sensory boundary, one that reveals how deeply our perception is shaped by Earth's acoustic environment. On this planet, silence always meant something. It was a signal of danger, reverence, contemplation. In space, it means nothing. It is the default. That disconnection, from both sound and meaning, creates a peculiar form of existential distance. Looking down at the Earth, astronauts often speak of the overview effect, a sudden cognitive shift in awareness. But part of that shift may come not from what they see, but from what they do not hear. The silence between the stars, indifferent and absolute, forces a kind of perceptual humility. In 1971, a researcher named R. Murray Schafer coined a term that would eventually launch an entire field: the soundscape. He was trying to define not a specific noise, but the total acoustic character of an environment, the sum of everything a person hears in a given place. Schafer was particularly interested in what he called schizophonia, the dislocation of sound from its source, as happens with radios, televisions, and loudspeakers. But underlying his theory was a simpler premise, that modernity had changed not just the kinds of sounds people heard, but the very nature of their sonic experience. The rise of industrialization, first in factories, then in cities, had layered human environments with mechanical repetition: gears, engines, jackhammers, sirens. By the mid-20th century, urban noise had become a kind of environmental constant, a persistent background hum that required no specific event to be noticed. It was no longer the sound of something happening. It was the sound of everything happening, all the time. This shift in baseline noise levels had measurable effects. Studies in environmental psychology began linking urban soundscapes to sleep disruption, elevated stress hormones, cognitive fatigue, and reduced performance in children. In classrooms near highways or flight paths, students scored lower on reading comprehension tests. In hospitals, patients exposed to continuous low-frequency noise recovered more slowly. What Schafer suspected, and what later data confirmed, was that the brain's attention system never fully disengages from noise. Even when we consciously tune it out, the auditory cortex remains active, scanning for signal amid the chaos. It is unpredictability. A continuous hum, like the drone of an air conditioner, can fade into the background. But sudden spikes in volume, especially from artificial sources, demand attention. A siren, a car horn, a barking dog, each triggers a brief reorientation of cognitive resources. Multiply those micro-interruptions over hours, and the brain's executive systems begin to strain. The cost is not dramatic, it is cumulative. Cities, in this sense, are not just louder than rural environments. They are temporally unstable. Sound arrives in irregular bursts, layered across inconsistent rhythms. A city is a polyrhythmic machine, and the brain, while adaptive, was not designed for endless pattern interference. To manage this overload, people seek islands of controlled quiet. In New York, the City Noise Project mapped public spaces based on average decibel levels, offering a cartography of relative stillness. In London, engineers began designing quiet pavement, using porous asphalt to reduce tire noise. In Tokyo, entire subway cars are designated as silent cars, where talking and phone use are prohibited. These are not aesthetic choices, they are infrastructural interventions, and they reflect a broader realization that silence in the modern city must be engineered. This has led to a proliferation of technologies marketed as solutions. Noise-canceling headphones, once a niche product for airline pilots, have become ubiquitous, their algorithms continuously analyzing ambient sound and generating inverse waveforms to nullify it. White noise machines mask variability by introducing sonic uniformity. Mobile apps now offer curated silences, loops of rainfall, fireplace crackle, or deep ocean hum, designed to overwrite the urban soundscape with simulations of nature. These tools work to varying degrees, but they raise a deeper question. What happens when silence itself becomes a product? This is not merely philosophical. In economic terms, quiet has become a luxury good. High-end cars advertise cabin silence as a selling point. Office buildings tout acoustic design as a productivity booster. Wellness retreats promise digital detox and sound baths. Real estate prices rise for properties on quiet streets. In an age of algorithmic attention, silence is not just rare, it is monetized. And yet, beneath this commodification lies a paradox. The very technologies used to create artificial quiet, sealed windows, headphones, digital filters, can reinforce the sense of disconnection that noise originally threatened. In sealing out the soundscape, we also seal out context. The siren fades, but so does the neighbor's laughter. The traffic disappears, but so does the child's piano practice next door. Silence becomes not presence, but isolation. This is where the original insight of Schaeffer's soundscape becomes most relevant. Sound is not just an environmental variable. It is a medium for orientation, spatial, emotional, social. Total silence, while soothing in short bursts, can quickly become dislocating. The goal is not absence, but intelligibility. We do not need silence at all times. We need the ability to know what sound means and to decide when to engage with it. Some urban designers are beginning to take this seriously. The quiet city is no longer imagined as a mute city, but as one that manages acoustic contrast. Parks that buffer highway noise with topography, museums that guide sound using reflective materials, schools that use soft partitions and staggered schedules to control reverberation. These are not utopian solutions. They are practical, systems-level responses to a deeply sensory problem. What they recognize is that silence is not a matter of turning volume down. It is a matter of structuring input. And this insight draws us back to the same neural principles seen in the anechoic chamber, in deep space, in dream, that the brain is always listening, and that what it hears, or fails to hear, changes what it is. Silence, for most of this history, has been examined as a physical or perceptual condition, a property of sound waves, of space, of neural circuitry. But there is one domain where silence becomes something altogether different: conversation. It is in the presence of others that silence changes character most dramatically, transforming from an environmental state into a social signal, charged with intention, emotion, and ambiguity. In the space between words, a different kind of meaning emerges. Every culture has rules about how long a pause can last before it feels uncomfortable. In Western societies, that threshold is often just 2 to 3 seconds. Beyond that, silence begins to carry weight. It implies hesitation, uncertainty, withdrawal. In Japanese conversation, silences of that same length may be perceived as thoughtfulness or respect. The pause is not interpreted as absence, but as presence, a moment of shared reflection. The silence says something. The key is knowing how to listen. This variability suggests that silence in social life is not defined by duration alone. It is shaped by expectation and context. A pause after a joke, a delay in answering a question, the silence that follows, a difficult confession. Each carries a different semantic load. Silence, in this sense, is not neutral. It is polyphonic. It speaks in the language of timing. Psycholinguists have studied this phenomenon. In one set of experiments, researchers recorded conversations and analyzed the microstructure of pauses, their length, placement, and overlap. What they found was that skilled conversationalists rarely let silence linger. They anticipate turn-taking, responding within fractions of a second. But more interestingly, when silences did occur, their meaning was determined less by length than by the surrounding dynamics. Was the speaker expected to reply? Was the question open-ended or rhetorical? Had emotion been signaled through tone or posture? The brain, always predictive, fills in these blanks. A delayed answer can be read as reluctance. A silence before speech can build suspense or anxiety. In couples therapy, one of the most closely studied indicators of emotional alignment is how silence is handled. Do both partners fall into it willingly? Does one rush to fill the gap while the other withdraws? Is the silence tense or tender? These micro-silences, often lasting only seconds, carry enormous relational weight. They can be invitations or rejections, space for truth or space for escape. In many cases, what matters most is not what the silence is, but who breaks it and how. This subtlety has made silence a crucial tool in diplomacy, negotiation, and performance. Skilled interviewers use silence to draw out more from a subject, letting discomfort do the work. Judges and therapists use silence to shift power dynamics, not by speaking, but by withholding. The pause becomes a lever, a test of what the other person will fill it with. In music, this technique has long been understood, but in language, it is more volatile. Because silence does not come pre-labeled, it is always interpreted. In high-stakes settings, a boardroom, a courtroom, a conflict at home, silence can be misread just as easily as it can be mastered. A partner who stops speaking may be shutting down or holding space. A negotiator's pause may signal weakness or control. The ambiguity is the point. Silence invites projection, and projection is what makes silence so dangerous and so powerful. This becomes especially clear in the context of conflict. When emotion runs high, silence shifts from a perceptual phenomenon to a regulatory one. It is not just that words are withheld. It is that silence becomes a mechanism for self-protection, or for pressure, or for shame. Some silences are tactical, others are involuntary, and the difference is often invisible. In psychological terms, silence during conflict can serve as both a defensive and a connective strategy. The person who withdraws may be overwhelmed, their nervous system triggering a freeze response. But to the person across from them, the same silence may appear cold, controlling, even punitive. This misalignment is one of the most common sources of escalation in the result is not resolution, but a recursive loop. Silence begetting speech, speech begetting more silence. Therapists trained in systems theory recognize this loop as a pattern, not of individual behavior, but of interaction. Silence is no longer just the absence of words, it is the presence of a structure, a patterned gap that repeats until named. Once identified, it can be interrupted, not necessarily with words, but with acknowledgement. I notice we go quiet after this topic comes up. That name, and once visible, it becomes something you can shape. In social media, this shaping becomes even more distorted. The absence of response, a message seen but not replied to, a comment ignored, creates a new kind of digital silence. It is performative, trackable, often public, and because it lacks tone or body language, it amplifies uncertainty. Was the silence intentional? Was it avoidance? Was it algorithmic? The ambiguity mirrors but magnifies the emotional charge of in-person silence. And because these exchanges happen in asynchronous, this raises an important shift in the role of silence in the digital era. We are no longer experiencing silence as an environmental condition, as in the monastery, the dream, the chamber, but as a communicative void in hyper-connected space. The more we expect constant feedback, the more any absence becomes amplified. Silence, in this context, is not empty. It is felt as interruption, even injury. Yet, despite these distortions, silence still retains its original functions. It still regulates attention. It still structures memory. It still invites imagination. And in conversation, it still signals presence or absence in ways no algorithm can fully replicate. In fact, in a world increasingly driven by artificial speech, silence may become the final index of the human. The pause, the hesitation, the choice not to speak. these remain stubbornly analog. This is why poets, monks, and designers continue to return to silence, not as an endpoint, but as a tool, a way to think, to orient, to perceive. In design, silence is the negative space that gives shape to form. In poetry, it is the white space around the line. In architecture, it is the pause between walls, the void that defines the room. Each of these disciplines understands what the auditory sciences have only recently begun to quantify, that silence is not absence, it is structure, and the meaning we make from it, in conversation, in memory, in space, depends not on how long it lasts, but on what we expect to fill it. The question, then, is not whether we need more silence. The question is whether we are prepared to recognize the kinds we already have, and what they are telling us. Because in the end, silence is not what remains when everything else is gone. It is what begins when we start to listen differently. If this episode helped you drift into a quieter kind of curiosity, we'd love to know. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is, and what moment in tonight's story stayed with you. And if you haven't already, consider liking and subscribing. It helps keep this little space of stillness growing, wherever you are. In a quiet room, under the stars, or just beginning to fall asleep.